Welcome to the Prosperity Gap, where we discuss the financial gap that exists between where we are and where we should be. It's time to bridge that gap.
Hey, Prosperity Nation, welcome back to the Prosperity Gap. My name's Dave Hall. I'm the host. So excited for today's show. Today, I've got one of my good friends with me today, Curtis Olsen. He's an estate planner with All About Trust. Curtis, how are you today?
Doing really well. Thank you.
Very excited about this show. We've known each other for a long time. You've always been a great supporter of mine. You've always been willing to share a lot of information that, whether you know it or not, many times is going back to many of our listeners and to people that I work with. Excited today to talk about trusts, wills, all those fun things that you get to do on a daily basis.
Excellent. I'm looking forward to it. It's been a lot of fun for me, so let's go to work.
Curtis, just so the listeners get a little better understanding about you, tell us a little bit about how you got into the industry and what it is exactly that you do on a daily basis.
Oh, that's a long story. I got into the financial planning game years ago, and after learning how finances work, I was always asking someone else to do all the estate planning for me, to write the wills and trusts. So when that opportunity presented itself to me to get into that game as well, I decided that was what I wanted to do. It's been a great career move for me. It's given me multiple opportunities to meet families and to help them and put things together for them. It's a great opportunity. I've been in it for about 10 years. I've done well over 1,000 estate plans.
You've been busy. Sounds like you've had a lot going on.
Yeah, it's a great business. It really is.
So let's talk a little bit. Let's get started here by talking a little bit about the living trust itself. What is it? Why do people need it? Maybe to start off initially by what is a living trust?
Well, I think the best way to explain that is probably kind of explain to you the options there are for estate planning. Okay, so basically there are three different options. The first option is don't do anything. If you don't do anything, you're going to go through this process called probate, and that's an ugly. That's like a four-letter word at my house. But probate is where the government or the county or the state settles your affairs. It's kind of expensive, takes a long time, and there's a lot of fees involved. Your second option is just to do a will. So a will is a document that does three things. This is all it does. It says who's in charge, who takes care of any minor children, and who gets what. And that's the only three things that a will does. What a will doesn't do is it doesn't transfer assets to beneficiaries. So think about this. When you were to sell your house, you would have to sign on the deed to transfer it to the buyer, correct?
Right.
Okay, so it requires a signature to transfer assets, the same as if you were going to liquidate bank accounts or liquidate assets. It requires a signature. A will goes into effect when you're dead. So it's really hard to get your signature once you're gone. So someone has to represent you, and that becomes the judge in the probate process. So think of a will as it doesn't do very much, and it also initiates probate. So even if you have a will, you have to go through probate. Your third option is to create a trust. Now, a trust is an entity just like a business where you are the president, you and your wife will be the presidents of your company, like a trust. You're called trustees. And you appoint someone to be your vice president, which is called a successor trustee. Now, when the will goes into effect when you're alive, right after you sign it, you take all of your assets and you transfer those into your trust. Remember, entity like a business. So now the trust owns your assets. When you pass away, your vice president or your successor trustee has the signature authority to sign and transfer the assets to the beneficiaries. Now the judge doesn't have to be involved. No one has to represent you. It's already taken care of. So think about the trust as an entity that holds your assets that can be transferred to your beneficiaries without the need to go through probate. Is that a long answer for a short question?
Yeah, no, that's a great answer. And for listeners, very well explained, because that's one of the questions that I know I've even had many times throughout my life, trying to understand. And I know people come up to me all the time is, what's the difference? You know, obviously, option number one is one that nobody wants to do, but then you get into option number 2 and 3. It's like, okay, is there ever a point that people could just do a will and that would be okay?
Yeah, there is. Probably when you just have children, you're young and you don't have a lot of assets, just to settle it, having a will is better than having nothing at all. But think about it more importantly is about your children. If something were to happen to you, who's going to take care of your kids? You need a will. Inside that will, it lists the guardian to take care of minor children.
Well, I think both of us have seen horror stories where nothing's been done. And now it's left up to a judge, it's left up to attorneys, generally, unfortunately, left up to that family member that you didn't want to have the assets or the kids, but is very aggressive and is going to pursue both of them in hopes of being able to get access to the money. So, yeah, I completely agree with you that having something there is definitely way better than doing nothing at all. So you talk a lot about the trust being basically it's the separate entity that's got assets. Is there a process that's required to actually fund that trust to make sure it's operating the way that it should be?
There is actually. So when you take your assets and put them in your trust, what you're doing is you're making the beneficiary of your assets. So think about if you went to the bank, there's a beneficiary listed as the paid on death beneficiary for your checking and savings accounts. You want to list those as your trust. So should something happen to you, the bank knows where to send the check. And they send it to the trust, which now your successor trustee can cash the check and deposit it. So yes, there's a process, and it has to do with changing the beneficiary or listing the ownership of the asset to be the trust.
And what happens if you don't do that? What's going to happen if you set up the trust but never fund the thing?
You know what? That's what happens a lot of the time. In fact, that's kind of my pet peeve. I struggle with that because I want everyone's assets in the trust. If it's not in the trust, it could be subject to probate. So even if you have a trust, that becomes a very expensive ream of paper when you don't put the assets in the trust.
So Curtis, let's talk about the process of keeping it updated. So I would guess there's two processes. One, making sure if you get new assets that you're always putting them in the name of the trust. That be correct? That anytime you buy a new home, you buy a new piece of property, can you talk a little bit about what should be done when that process happens?
Yeah, when I help families with a trust, I give them a workbook. And the workbook is a detailed list of their assets. And what we do is we go through that list and we identify all of the assets they have so that we know that they're in the trust. Essentially, it becomes a checklist. Now, every year, you want to go through and review that workbook and go through those assets again to make sure if there's any new or additional assets or if anything has changed. It also works, this workbook works as a directory for your kids. So think about this when you're gone, your kids are going to say, well, where's all mom and dad's stuff? So if it's organized and detailed in a workbook where they can just pull it up in the trust documents or in the binder that I give them, they can see where all the assets are, who to contact at the bank, who to contact for their investments, who to contact about their real estate, all of their different assets. So that workbook is how we keep things updated.
And you can't imagine how helpful that is until you have to go through it. I unfortunately have had to go through it with my own family. Both of my parents have passed away and my stepmother. So we've gone through basically having our parents die, and it was quite a process. Luckily, my parents did have a trust. Unfortunately, they had excluded some of my brothers and sisters years before and never got them added back into the trust. And I'd like to talk about that a little bit here in a minute as well.
Absolutely.
And they had the trust, but they didn't have things organized. So I remember spending almost 2 days just going through file cabinets and paper. And unfortunately, my stepmother was the last to pass away. She was a hoarder. So you can imagine there's just stuff everywhere. 2 days I'm digging through just trying to figure out what they actually had because I was the trustee and I was the one responsible to deal with all this stuff.
Yeah, I always say it depends. If they just have a will, I always say put your least favorite child in charge of your will. And that's always paybacks because they have to go through probate.
Right.
For all those terrible things they did when you were raising them. But you put your favorite child in charge of your trust because that makes it really simple and easy. The organization of your trust is critical. I would say that's the hardest part and the easiest part. Most families don't have any direction of what to do after their trust is done. So having a workbook or an organizer to do that really makes all the difference.
And should there be some discussion had before death? I mean, is it helpful for families to actually talk about this stuff? And if you're assigning kids to be the trustee or there's assets out there, is it wise to have discussions about it prior to passing away?
Absolutely. When choosing the different fiduciaries involved with your trust, because there's several different documents that are prepared in an estate plan, not only a trust, but a power of attorney, healthcare directive, there's a will, final disposition, final instructions. There's several things that should happen. And so with each one of the families I work with, I give them a breakdown of those different roles and responsibilities. So as they have those discussions, they know what they can do. There's nothing worse than finding out that you're in charge of something when you can't get out of it, or finding out they don't want to do it when they're already in charge of it.
It's very interesting. I actually had that experience here about 3 months ago, and now it makes me not feel so important. I actually, when you talk about putting the worst son in charge of the will, I actually had been assigned as the person to oversee a will for a guy that I knew. I'd bought a convenience store from him 15 years ago. And I guess our friendship was such that he believed, instead of his kids or any family member, that I should be the one that should be put in charge of everything. And I get this phone call saying, hey, unfortunately, this gentleman's died. And guess what? You're in charge. Now, luckily, I had some attorneys and some other people, and they were able to remove me very quickly because I had had no involvement in his life for probably 10 years. But yeah, it was very shocking to me to wake up and find out that somehow he had either thought something of me or figured he'd give me a mess once he passed on.
I can imagine what that's like. I would suggest that people go through every 5 years and have an update, have a review done with your estate planner. Look at the assets annually, but at least every 5 years, look at things. That could have been resolved pretty quickly.
Yeah, and I mentioned that a little bit before on my own side. My family had this falling out after my mom passed away. My dad had gotten remarried, and with the fallout, my dad had gone in and had everything redone on the trust, kicked out, basically disinherited 3 of my brothers and sisters. And then over time, they were able to get everything mended, but he didn't go back in and change it. And unfortunately, it caused all kinds of pain inside of our family once he passed on. And these family members realized that Dad had never changed the trust again. One, that he'd changed it to start with, but 2, they'd never changed it back. And basically, they were disowned. And it wasn't there was a lot of money. I mean, Dad was a very poor guy, but it's just the concept and the thought that man, Dad really did this to us and really had this strong feelings against us.
One of the things that I ask families is, if you've ever known a family that doesn't speak to each other after mom and dad died, I rarely get the answer of, I never heard of that before. Most families have that they have to deal with that for sure.
Yeah, it happens all the time, unfortunately, and especially if you get large money involved, if it's not clearly spelled out. I remember when I first started in the accounting industry, one of the first accounts I worked on was an estate for a gentleman that passed away, and it had millions of dollars of life insurance. And it was enough money to truly take care of the family for a number of years, if not for the rest of their lives, if they would have handled it correctly. And instead, grief got in, and within about 5 or 10 years, the money had run out. And all of these family members were doing was fighting. It was such an eye-opener to me as a young accountant to say, hey, I need to set this up correctly. I need to make sure I've got things done right on my end, so my family's not going to have to go through this process.
I've experienced several of those experiences. I've had that several times. It's sad. It really is sad. If you don't prepare, things can really change. And money changes people.
Yeah, unfortunately, it really does. Curtis, if you look at the trust by itself, so now we've set up the trust, we fund the trust. I know one of the questions many people have is, are there restrictions now to what I can do with the money and the assets that I put in there as long as I'm living?
That really depends on the type of trust that you need. So think of it as some restrictions and no restrictions. If we do a revocable living trust, the government and everyone else looks at you and your trust as the same, but it does still protect you from probate and transfer your assets to your beneficiaries. So with that type of trust, you basically can do anything you want with it. It's very, very open. You can transfer things in and out simply and easily. But if you get into the irrevocable or the unchangeable trust products, then you're going to have some challenges of what to do. So you work with a trustee, and this is just a little bit more challenging, a little bit more involved.
Let's talk more about the living trust here before we jump into. I'd like to talk about some details. The irrevocable trust, we have time, but if you look at the revocable or the living trust, and we talk about these accounts that are getting set up, the control, the ability that people have, is there a separate tax ID number? Again, is this as simple as just being able to provide trust documents to open accounts? What do people have to do? Say they're trying to open a bank account. That's
a really good question. While you're alive, your trust and you are the same. So normally it operates just on your social security number. It's not till you pass away when your social security number is no longer valid. You have to get a tax ID number. So typically we just run it with your social security number. So that's how it's all just acts normal. You go down to the bank and just let them know you have a trust. In our trust package we put together, we provide you with the documents needed to verify and document that there's a trust in place.
And there's no additional tax filings. Is that correct? Everything basically just
that's correct. And unless you run a business out of your trust, it wouldn't have a tax ID number, so there's no additional tax filings at all.
So as far as operationally, that revocable living trust, grantor trust, pretty simple process. Again, once they get it set up, as long as they're funding it correctly, they're getting their assets in there, as long as they're comfortable with the beneficiaries, they're having it reviewed on a regular basis. Not a lot of additional work that needs to go into the process, sounds like, and really have all the freedom that they had before. It's just if they pass away, now there's some direction on what's going to happen to the assets.
That's correct. Absolutely. It's very, very simple to operate. There's not a lot of documentation, just making sure that your assets are funded properly. And that's basically all you need to do.
Is there any asset protection involved with a living revocable trust?
There really isn't any legal protection or asset protection with a revocable living trust. There are options when you pass away because that becomes an irrevocable trust. But basically, a revocable trust is designed to protect you from probate. And that's why we have all the other different types of trusts that you can do to protect your assets and so forth. It really just depends on the situation. But for basic 90% of the population, a revocable living trust does everything they need it to do.
And I think it is important that our listeners understand that there are various types. I mean, we talk here, the only two we really talked about is a revocable and irrevocable. But I mean, if you're getting into the trust world and especially complex tax planning, there are all kinds of trusts, from asset protection trusts, offshore trusts. I mean, the trust options go on and on and on. Very important to understand that. And I think for listeners, it's very important to understand that each of them has a different purpose. And just as Curtis is saying here, for most of you that have just standard family, making standard income, living trust is going to provide you with everything that you need. You're going to have to use insurance if you want asset protection, either use LLCs or insurance of some form to provide you that protection. But it is going to provide you some great peace of mind with the ability to transfer the assets and make sure things are going to happen the way you want them to when you're pass on and you no longer really have a say in what's going to happen.
Absolutely. 100%.
So briefly, let's talk about irrevocable trusts. What makes them so different from a living or a revocable trust?
Well, an irrevocable trust is designed to protect your assets. So think about if you could take a home that you currently own and transfer that home into belongs to someone else. Then if you were to get sued or something like that were to happen, you no longer own that home. It's not yours, so they couldn't attach a lien or win a judgment or something against it. And that's how it protects the asset. It removes it from your name and puts it in the name of a trust, which is a separate entity. It's not you. So that's how it protects you. Basically not yours, and someone else controls that asset. That's the trustee that you work with.
And the irrevocable nature is basically such that, I mean, very hard to change. Is that right? Is that where the irrevocable side comes from? Because you truly are trying to protect yourself or make an actual transfer of assets?
Yeah. When you think of an arm's length transaction where it's no longer yours. You can always put a home in your wife's name, but that's still you. Legally, because it's still you guys are married. But if you were to take that home and put it in my name, now we're completely different. There's no attachment between you and I, so it's an arm's length transaction. Now I would own and control your home where you wouldn't. Therefore, that's how it protects you, is there's nothing that legally they can attach to it and so forth. It's still yours. You're still the beneficiary of the trust and the owner of the trust. But because it's no longer yours, it's mine, that creates a separation.
Very good explanation. Very good way to explain it in Prosperity Nation. Hopefully you're getting the understanding of everything that's being taught here and helping you understand how to make better financial decisions. And it's so many times it seems like we're making decisions that are only based upon today. And if you look at a trust, that's really not why you're making a decision to set up a trust or a will. You're not looking at what's going to affect you today. You're not going to see really any current tax benefits. You're not going to see any asset protection benefits. But let me tell you, when you pass it on, it's going to make all the difference in the world to your beneficiaries and those people you really, truly love and care about.
Yeah, you like I said, you put your favorite child in charge of your trust. And that's what makes it easy for them. You want to take care of them. So that's very, very true.
I remember early on that we had a client who hated the IRS, hated attorneys even more. And so throughout his life, he basically did everything he could to pay as little tax and as few legal fees as he ever had to. I mean, he was such a cheapskate to some level on everything he did. In fact, I remember one time that he went out to breakfast with one of my other clients, and the wife happened to order something on the menu that was $10, and they had something that was $3, and he chewed the man out saying, "What the heck? Why are you allowing your wife to spend so much money?" And they're both multimillionaires. They all had all the money they needed, but he was so conservative. But the ironic thing is when he died, and we'd talked to him about it multiple times, he'd never set up a trust. And so he ended up paying the attorneys and the IRS way more money than he ever would have had to. And to some level, probably all the money they saved during his life just ended up going to him when he passed on.
When, that brings up a very important point. The cost of doing a trust compared to the cost of going through probate, the trust is a whole lot less over your lifetime. Now, you may think that the cost of doing a trust is expensive. Oh, it's an exorbitant fee. It's not that expensive when you compare the cost of going through probate. Probate is very expensive. And think about just doing a will, you still have to go through probate. So compare the difference. The trust is much less expensive.
Yeah, very good point. And I'm glad you brought that up, which also leads into another question that often is asked is, do I have to have an attorney to actually file those trust documents, or are there other options out there?
Oh, that's a great question. An attorney is not required. In fact, anyone can actually do a trust themselves. They don't need anyone to do it for them. I'm sure that you can find a program or some kind of service that would allow you to fill in the blank and create a trust. The hard part with that is when there's no direction, there's no guidance. What if you did it wrong? You wouldn't even know. So having an estate planner put something together that makes it simple, makes it easy, and has some clear direction makes all the difference in the world. Plus, there's different laws and requirements on each state each state has different ones. So knowing what those are and being prepared, a little guidance would be helpful. But no, having an attorney write your trust is not required.
It's always funny to me as a professional how many times you hear people come up and tell you what their friend's doing, and they can't understand why they're not able to do that. And yet it's because they live in a different state. They don't have all the facts. There's certain things that don't apply to them. And I think you're making a very important point there, Curtis, is that when we're dealing with trust, your story is not going to be the same as everyone else's story. Although the trust in general may look the same, you're going to live in a different state. You're going to have different assets. You're going to have different beneficiaries that you want to be able to take advantage of any leftover assets that you may have. I mean, all of these things are going to be different. So for you to just go get a cookie cutter program and put that in there, the sad thing is you're never going to know until 40 years from now or 60 years from now or 100 years from now when you pass on, and then somebody else has to clean up the mess and deal with the fact that you didn't do your homework and put in the time to make sure you got the right documents.
Yeah, I would look at it like this. If you were to mess up on a couple things, just simple things, and they throw the trust out and make you go through probate, not only the money or the time and energy you spent in putting together your documents is wasted, but now you have your whole family to go through probate because you didn't do it correctly. Now, there is something to be said about using attorneys because they're held liable. Is it required? Absolutely not.
And the other thing people need to really be aware of is the fact that it's not, when you're looking at trust and you're looking at updating it, it's not just family situations. I mean, you and I have talked about my family, the situations that happened there, but there's laws that change. 2017, we had a major tax change when Trump put in many of his new laws, and some of those affected estate planning and affected trusts. And I think it's very important that people realize that too, that not only on a federal level, but sometimes on state level, there's things changing. Thus, very important that you're having it reviewed and updated on a regular basis.
I agree. Absolutely. There's things that could affect you that you don't even know about.
Yeah, it's amazing in our lives. There's so much information online. It seems many times there's certain things obviously we can do online. Very easy to do, very easy to set up, but there are definitely other aspects of our lives. In Prosperity Nation, I would say this is one of those. You definitely want to make sure you have a professional involved because just as Curtis is saying, I mean, when you consider the minimal cost that it takes to set that up and to make sure the trust is operating correctly over your lifetime, I mean, probate can get upwards to 10% of your assets. If you have $500,000 worth of assets, I mean, that's $50,000 that you're basically throwing down the drain. That if you had done a little bit of homework and put everything together, and if like for my family, again, there was nowhere near that many assets. All I had to do is pull out the trust document, go to the bank, go to the various places, say, hey, I'm the trustee. And, just like that, I had everything settled and money distributed out to the various beneficiaries, and we were able to move forward.
Well, you're absolutely right. Having the documents in place, really, it's more of the having things in writing about this is what you want to happen. Think about this. What if the family contests it? What if they say, I don't like it that way, I want more? Now you're going to go through the probate process contested, and that's when the real legal fees start to rack up. I've seen families that lose millions going through probate. So probate is the process. The arguing and the fightings really could cause a lot more problems.
Yeah, and heaven forbid you get someone that's just so emotionally tied that they can't give it up, and you're just going to waste all the money by the time you're done. Something we haven't talked about at all yet really is beneficiaries. Curtis, is there a standard process, or are there things that people should be aware of when they're picking their beneficiaries?
Well, this is really when we get down to find out who's the favorite and least favorite child. The typical thing is they split things evenly amongst their children, but there are times when you have certain children who have done more, certain children who have done less. Maybe there's a situation where you have special needs kids. You've got to make some big decisions about how you want things distributed. A trust allows you to say what happens when I'm gone and how this money needs to be distributed, whether it's proportionately or whether it's equally, or even with some restrictions, like maybe there's missions or college or education that you want to pay for, and this is how I want this trust set up. You have control over what happens with your assets, even after you're gone.
And it's great that people understand that, and great that people know how this works, because I know it can get messy too when you're dealing with previous marriages, kids that may not be living with you. So my recommendation would be to just make sure you give it some thought, make sure you're thorough. Again, as things change, make sure you're getting that updated. Are there any requirements? I mean, if someone is married, is there a requirement at all that the spouse has to be the first beneficiary, or can that go to anyone? I mean, do those assets go to anyone you choose?
There are some legal requirements, but essentially, it's whatever you and your spouse decide you want to do with those assets. That's how things are distributed. We also have options for some tax planning with what we call an AV trust, where you can your trust divides into two trusts. If you're over the estate planning, the estate tax guidelines, you can save some taxes that way. There's some basic things that you can do to make sure that things are done that protect you the most way possible. Is that a fair answer?
Yeah. Absolutely. No, it's very interesting. The other day, I guess it goes back probably a year and a half ago, but we were talking about these various topics in my family. My kids are always joking around about what they're going to inherit, what they're going to get. My 10-year-old pipes up and says, Dad, I don't care if I get anything else, but I want your car. I thought, well, I hope I don't die quick enough that car is of any value to you. But I guess if that's what you want, you can have the car.
You must drive a nice car.
I'm not sure it's that nice, but for them, they think it is. So that's what you think.
That's good.
Ought to be in his inheritance. The other kids can have the money. He'll take the car.
That's perfect.
Curtis, we've covered a lot of topics today. We've talked about a lot of very important things to our listeners, and it's been a very informative show. Anything else that you can think of that we really didn't cover that you think would be helpful for our listeners to better understand regarding trust, wills, or making sure they're prepared so for an unfortunate death if it were to happen?
I think the biggest thing that I help clients with is just to have a peace of mind that they've done things correctly. The most important part of your trust is the funding of your trust, making sure the assets are in the trust. Because if they're not, they could be subject to probate, and you've wasted a lot of time and money on something that couldn't happen. So having that process of updating your trust on a continual basis and making sure things are done correctly is the key. That's probably I'm the biggest stickler with my clients to make sure the trust is funded correctly and it's updated on a regular basis. That's where I go. That's what's important.
Well, thanks, Curtis. And you're absolutely right in what you're doing. I know that's why I like working with you. I know that's why I love our relationship, is because I know you're forcing the right thing to happen. I can't tell you how many times as a CPA, I've seen it where clients get super excited. They go out to a professional, they get their trust set up, and then nothing happens. In 3, 4, 5, 10 years down the road, I'm saying, guys, you need to get this thing funded. And it just never seems to come together. And that's what I love about what you do is you're very thorough in making sure those things happen. I know when you've worked with me and helping set up trust, the clients have been very happy to know that it's not only set up correctly, but that things are funded correctly so that they're going to have a good experience, not only for themselves, and which working with you is a great experience, but also for their beneficiaries when that time comes, that they can just keep it very simple and make sure everything's taken care of.
It just takes a little time every year to make sure that things are done correctly. We have that communication on an annual or even semi-annual basis to follow through, make sure that things are done correctly. I also think having a coach, a financial coach there to walk them through the steps where they can ask questions. And, I give every one of my clients my cell phone number. They don't have to call the office. They call me directly and I answer their questions. And
no, I think that's very important, especially in this day and age. It's very important we have access to people so we get the right information. Curtis, thank you so much for being on our show today.
You're welcome. Hey, it was a pleasure. Thank you, Dave.
You have been listening to The Prosperity Gap, the show where we help you bridge your financial gap to get you where you want to be. My name's Dave Hall. I've been your host. I've been here today with Curtis Olsen.